Hello there, one and all, and welcome to SaberDuel Gaming, where we always take the high ground. And welcome to our retro review of Double Dragon on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Recently, right here on this channel, I did a review of Cobra Kai: The Story Continues, and in doing so I made reference to how its side-scrolling combat style was reminiscent of a lot of the earlier beat-em-up games on the home consoles. I actually referenced games such as Streets of Rage and, quite bizarrely, even Golden Axe, yet for some reason I neglected to mention this absolute classic, which in many ways is one of the founding fathers of combat games. The original Double Dragon was released in arcades in 1987 and was unsurprisingly a huge success. This success made it inevitable that it was going to be released on home consoles and computers, and eventually in 1988 it was released on the Nintendo Entertainment System, although it did have to suffer a number of downgrades in order for the Nintendo's humble powers to be able to manage the game. The most obvious of these was a visible downgrade in the graphics. As well as this, we also missed out on the two-player cooperative mode, and it was noticeable that only two enemy characters could be on the screen at any one time, and they both had to be of the same character model. But all these aside, how did the game actually rank and play at the time? Well, let's be clear, while these graphics and this gameplay looks massively dated right now, you have to remember that this was a good 3 years before games like Street Fighter 2 and Streets of Rage completely changed the fighting game industry. Beat-em-ups were a very different thing back at this point. Hell, we didn't even have the Mega Drive or the SNES, so this coming out for the Nintendo was pretty much as good as it got. Fans were given two main game modes. Game Mode A was very clearly the main mode, which allowed the player to side-scroll along, fight a number of villains, then keep moving along. This may seem pretty basic now, but at the time, this ability to walk across and continue across different screens was actually quite revolutionary, and it was done deliberately to allow a feeling of progression. It's also got to be noted as well that the different levels all had their own unique look, and whilst the colour schemes and designs were basic, it did feel like you were travelling to different locations and fighting different bosses, such as this big old guy here. The game also introduced new concepts into the beat-em-up franchise, being allowed to pick up weapons, and even weapons that your enemies had dropped. This again may seem basic, but was pretty neat at the time, and it gave people a feeling of an interactive environment that they could really use to fight their enemies. It is a shame that it couldn't manage to include the co-op fighting, but that was just not something the NES was going to be capable of at the time. And that's where we come on to Game Mode B. Game Mode B allowed you to pick two identical characters, all bosses or main characters from within the game, and go head to head, either against the CPU or a second player. Theoretically, that made this a very basic and early development version of something like Street Fighter 2, probably very similar to the original Street Fighter. However, there's a reason why that game is not referenced very often, and that is that the games consoles and even the arcades at the time just really couldn't hack a proper one-on-one fighting game. So in truth, it was always going to be Game Mode A that the game was judged on, and the NES version of the game was generally judged very well. It usually got scores in the low 80s, though some did delve down into the 70s, and there was some debate as to whether the NES or the Master System versions of the game were the best, but either way, out of all the home consoles and computers, the Nintendo version really ranked up there amongst the best ones, so it did do very well. But that's not why we're here. We're here to find out how well this game plays now. Anyone can look up to see what scores it got back then, but what happens when you play it now? Well, it has to be said, the graphics and the gameplay has dated quite a lot, but if I'm honest, it doesn't really stop it being a fun game to play. Whilst the graphics and the range of moves may have improved in games like this, the reality is, there isn't very much to improve on. You walk, you fight, and then you carry on walking. It's basic, it's simple, but it does the job. And if you're okay with these graphics, hell, or if you find a little bit of charm in retro graphics, this game still has a great deal of fun to offer. So overall, maybe it hasn't aged that badly anyway. Unless we're talking about Game Mode B. Game Mode B has aged terribly. But let's see what score we get. While the graphics are dated and the B mode sucks, I generally think this still deserves a 6.5 out of 10. It's a really fun game to review. Thanks for watching, and feel free to subscribe here on YouTube, TikTok or Instagram.